Okay, just to finish off on this, then we don't need to do any more on constructivism. um, this is the video I was talking about. Is this guy called Dennis Heiber, and he comes from some Canadian religious university, by the sound of it. And he he begins by making the point that the social construction of reality is very threatening to Christians. So he begins with that statement. If you watch the video right to the end, he gets out of it. Obviously, from what I've said so far, constructivists, broadly speaking, which we may or may not be happy with, consider religion to be non-material culture, an example of. Okay, so he's clearly a person of faith, and at the end of the video, he gets out of the sort of conundrum that he creates for himself by arguing that religion is a social construct. So have a look at that. It's quite interesting the way he gets out of it. Not ideal for atheists or agnostics or constructivists necessarily, but for people of faith, it's actually quite a good way to get out of a hole that you've dug for yourself, in a sense. So that's worth kind of looking at that. The social world. So I've said a little bit about this already, just to reinforce this in this last hour that we've got on this topic. According to Heiber, the social construction of reality means the process whereby people continuously create, through our actions and interactions, a shared reality that is experienced as objectively factual and subjectively meaningful. I mean, we're talking about quite difficult metaphysical concepts. You know, what's reality? It's not like, you know, you're not going to have a conversation with somebody about this over a cappuccino, are you? It is a difficult sort of thing, and it's hard to relate this to the, you know, scholarly academic work. Anyway, nevertheless, I think it's worth sort of thinking about. It might be disturbing to people to go outside of the door and think there's no one shared reality, and so that might be one thing. But anyway, this is only what constructivists say. So whether we like it or not, this is their sort of position on this. So we've got the world's kind of divided into two: natural physical world, natural physical facts on the one hand, and then we've got the social world. That's what we are interested in here, in trying to understand. Social world includes everybody in this room, everything that we know about, but it also includes the relationship that we've created between states. In other words, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and the United States and the former Soviet Union and the Palestinians and Israel has been created by humans. That's a social construct. It's not been given by God. It's not normal. It's not natural. It's not preordained. Nobody's intervened. It's constructed. It's the product of human social construction. So what he means by this is that it's the process whereby people continuously create, through actions and interactions, a shared reality. I've read that already. So we'll change page now. So this repeats what I've just said. The social world is not given, natural, revealed, determined, inevitable. So if it's not, and we're focusing on studying conflict in Kashmir, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Gaza, in Africa, in South Asia, all around the world, if the world is not fixed, is not given, natural, revealed, determined, inevitable, then if we accept that it's constructed, then that creates in my mind a sort of an optimistic thing, in the sense that if we've made it, we've constructed it, we can change it. So it's subject to change. So peace studies, peace research, peace studies at Bradford, it started in 1973-4, was started because not only did some people think that we should study peace. If you can study peace, that's another question. But if you did study peace, you should not just study it from an academic standpoint. You should do that with a view to changing the world in a non-violent way. So very laudable set of aspirations, you know, upon which the PSID was PS on its own, but it merged with the idea a couple of years ago, you know, was originally founded. If we can analyse the world in which we live, then if we can then see what's wrong with it and change it in a non-violent way, then that might be a solution to some of our problems, because we resort to violence at the earliest opportunity in order to extend our interests, whether they be the interests of states or politics or ideologies or religions or cultures or identities or whatever that may be. So constructivism is an optimistic, flexible thing in a way, in many ways. So that's maybe one thing that's good about it. Heibert's argument, and do watch the video, it's kind of interesting, is made up. He argues that the social world and everything we know in it is not only made up by humans, but it's transmitted from humans to other humans. So 95% of what we know, he argues, we simply accepted from other people that have gone before us, as it were. So that's one thing. It can be changed, it can be deconstructed, reconstructed, and it has been, according to constructivists, continuously throughout history. So I've made some diagrams here which may or may not make the situation more complicated. But basically, the one on the left, the circle on the left, is a depiction of the natural and physical world, which we find. If humans didn't exist, it'd still be the natural and physical world, there'd still be natural and physical facts. We would still find a mountain, still find a river. I mean, so they would still be there without humans ever existing in the first place anyway. And we've been on this planet, let's say, for argument's sake, between 100,000 years and some people argue a lot longer, maybe 250,000 years. Maybe there's evidence, archaeologically speaking, we've been around longer. But let's say 100,000 years. The monotheisms that this is referring to, and also the polytheistic religions that it's referring to, the monotheisms have only been around 2,000. So for 98,000 years out of the 100, we've only seen the monotheism emerge, as it were, the formal institutions of religion, about 2,000, 3,000, maybe 4,000 in the case of Buddhism, Hinduism, older religions. So we've got the natural and physical world on one hand, but what we're interested in is the social world. We're interested in what that's made up of, and that's the one that we've created, and it's characterized by culture, an umbrella term, culture. Everything we do is culture, apart from maybe EastEnders, which is a British soap. You probably don't follow that anyway. So culture is what characterizes what we do, what we make, what we create. And you can divide that into material culture and non-material culture. Material culture, as you can see, is hammers and tools and science and technology, and roads and computers. All of these things would not exist had humans not created them. Neither would weapons, chemical, biological, conventional, nuclear, human and social constructs. So examples of material culture. So that's one thing. On the other side is non-material culture, and in that section comes values, norms, belief, institutions, and with that we find examples of non-material culture, which I've broadly defined as, in terms of examples, marriage and institution of marriage. We can't see, we can't touch it, we can't feel it, we can't measure it. We know it's there. We all do it. Well, most of us do it. It's an accepted notion that there is an institution that we've created. I mean, how do we study it if we can't see it, touch it, measure it, feel it, observe it? Realism's no good. We can't. It relies on observation, objective observation. If you can't do that with marriage, how do you interpret marriage from a sort of a scientific perspective, from a positivist perspective? You know, it's difficult. Realism's no good for understanding marriage, maybe. So the irony being that we create nuclear weapons and then we create institutions like the NPT, which we seek therefore to try and mitigate and prevent the misuse of nuclear weapons. That's probably not the right phrase, but the use of nuclear weapons. We have the NPT. Not everyone's in the NPT. India and Pakistan are outside the NPT. So are the North Koreans. And so would, in future, Iran, be outside. Of course, the North Koreans left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's not even a ban on nuclear weapons. It's a bargain. It basically says we can keep ours. When I say we, I mean the UK, France, the US, and China, the other de facto nuclear weapons powers. We can keep ours. You can't get nuclear weapons. Obviously, not in the case of North Korea, China. Not in the case of North Korea, China, India, and Pakistan. Not China. But it basically says it's not a disarmament treaty, right? There's a vague commitment that states involved in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty will undertake to enter into negotiations in good faith to get rid of, to disarm to the lowest point consistent with the interests of national security. That does not mean getting rid of nuclear weapons. It means that we can keep them. So the West, the US, Russia, and China, and the UK and France, we can keep them. You can't get them. When I say you, aspiring nuclear proliferators can't get them. You can have the technology for peaceful purposes in order to make energy, electricity. You can't use them, turn that capability into weapons, because then we'll gang up on you and we'll forcibly, that's the idea. There's nothing that's gentle or ethical, nothing much about international politics, I don't think. So we've obviously done that in the case of India, which is weird. And Pakistan got in nuclear weapons because India got them, And of course, North Korea realized very, very clearly that if you're a nuclear weapons power, there is probably not a military solution to your existence, right? So maybe that's an explanation as to why North Korea, because they know, there's nearly 1 million armed soldiers on the border between North and South Korea. And and the fact that they may have a nuclear capability makes North Korea a very difficult problem to deal with. So we engage in negotiations in good faith to try and arrive at a situation where we can disarm, and the same maybe would apply to Iran, an aspiring nuclear weapons power. Pakistan and the US, I think, have a very close relationship for nuclear matters, I think. But anyway, those important nations. They're outside of the official nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime. The institution that we've created is socially constructed to manage nuclear weapons. We have countries outside of it, And there are some on the brink that could also quite easily become nuclear capable. I think Saudi Arabia has expressed an interest. In the past, South Africa had ambitions to become a nuclear power, and may well have done, in the past. And of course, Ukraine inherited nuclear weapons from Russia. It was on its soil, gave them back, and that. But Japan could probably easily transition to become a nuclear power, I would imagine. And maybe there are other examples of that. Clearly, Iran and Saudi Arabia nuclear weapons, that's an interesting kind of dynamic, isn't it? Adds a further level of complexity to an already very complicated region. So institutions are non-material culture. And so if you go over the page then with that, clicking on the wrong thing. So our total environment is made up of this physical, natural environment, but we're not kind of interested in that per se. We're interested in the social world, which is characterized by culture, which is created by humans, and we're interested in material forms of culture, which relate to the things I've been talking about, weapons and pencils and hammers and nails and roads and computers, but we're also interested in non-material culture, which is about beliefs, norms, and values and institutions as well. So again, we just carry on with, we touched on this issue, race. So this is potentially a very controversial aspect of constructivism as well, and race being an example of a social construct. And so the reason why I'm repeating this is because if we go to the next section, we can see that if you go into, I've done this because it's on your behalf in the sense that if you're interested in this issue, you could sort of search Google for it. But so what I've done is I found some videos. So this guy, Professor John Dewey, professor of philosophy somewhere, a quite well-known one actually, I think. Anyway, focuses on pragmatism, this sort of concept, weird concept. But if you look at things from a genetic point of view, he argues certain kinds of molecular sequences are more common in some groups and not in other groups. And I think his explanation for why that might be the case is because geographically and environmentally speaking, if you originate, historically speaking, from a certain part of the world, then environmental influences may have an impact on actually, your genetic makeup, as it were. But it's believed that that's not considered to be significant. So what he says is that during the course of human history, the separation of human groups has occurred, and you do see some variation in the human genome, as it were. But he argues that the differences are trivial. There is far more variation within than there is between such groups. What this is an argument to say is that humans are much more similar to each other than they are different, and it's impossible to make a distinction in regard to where one racial group ends and where another one begins. And so that is a difficult sort of a notion, I think, to get your head around. And then another example, there's nothing inherently biological about race. A group of people who share distinct physiological characteristics is one that society thinks are important and biological. However, the argument is that race is a social construct we create and give meaning to race, and it is a product of the notion of race, and with that, the notion of racism, another social construct, is a product of white colonial power and invented claims of superiority. This is another website that deals with this issue. So moving on again, race is socially constructed. The physical distinctions we use to categorize people and the meanings of those differences are created by humans. Definitions of race have changed throughout history. Skin color is not inherently meaningful, but is given meaning based on social classification that's been invented by humans. Race helps to solidify power dynamics. So how useful is this? I've showed you a couple of dissertations. The introductory sequences to those show that students have used this. And it's a good thing because we can tick that box. Your dissertation is methodologically, epistemologically, theoretically informed. According to this slide, this is from the Collins textbook, which is really worth getting hold of. Debate still exists over whether constructivism is a theory or an approach or an orientation. Some argue that it's not a substantive theory of politics, but rather a social theory that makes claims about the nature of social life and social change, or a theoretically informed approach. So that would answer the question: what is it? If it exists, what is it? Is it theory? Is it methodology? The different kinds of constructivism, which I'll say a few words about. One of the things that makes it very similar to post-positivist approaches, critical security, human security, gender, etc., is that it privileges the notion of the importance of ideas, and it focuses on the importance of identity. And the interaction in the international system, in other words, the relationship between the former Soviet Union and the United States, for example, is not given or natural. On the contrary, the human world is considered to be one of artifice. The human world is constructed through the actions of the actors themselves. So constructivism can be used, in order to understand the relationship between individuals and groups, for example, but it can be used to understand, to a certain extent, the way in which states relate to each other as well. So constructivism puts into context the actions and beliefs and interests of actors and understands that the world they inhabit has been created by them and impacts upon them. So it's a bit of a weird notion, we sort of create the world in which we live, and then we have to sort of negotiate and manage that world that we've, at the same time created ourselves. In some ways, they're sympathetic to post-positivist approaches, like critical approaches, because they reject the focus in realism on the importance of the state as an actor in world politics. And with that, this rejection of the focus on the state is accompanied by a rejection of the methodological assumptions of positivism and of the theory of realism, upon which realism, is built in terms of its relationship to positivism. So you start to see some kind of unhelpful language creep into the debate where constructivism is concerned. And so they focus on what they call normative and ideational structures. They focus on identities, and they are interested in the role of agents and structures. So agents and structures, they argue, are mutually constituted, so made up by each other and feed off each other and are constantly evolving and changing. So to compare the two, realists of different persuasions, neo-realists, neo-liberal, would understand state behavior in terms of the distribution of material capabilities, and state interest, they argue, would be defined in material terms. So what states do is they grab material power, in other words. That's what realists, neo-realists and liberals would argue. Whereas, on the contrary, constructivists would argue that ideas, or normative or ideational structures, are both important and matter much more, and that ideas are center stage and are privileged. Problem with this, of course, is I don't think it gets us very far in terms of our understanding of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. I think on the one level I would accept that the relationship between them is constructed. There's no world governing power. There's no international government that controls what all the other governments do. So the UK as a state is in a sort of a competition, as it were, on the international stage with France, with Germany, with all the other members of the European Union, and with the US and with Russia and all. So there's nothing that governs how we relate toward each other, and that environment is known as anarchy. Okay, and the argument that the constructivists make is that that anarchy that we find in the international system of states is also constructed. It's made by humans. It wouldn't exist had humans not created it, as it were. So it gets us so far, but it doesn't allow us to understand why Russia attacked Ukraine. And so these approaches, I think, provide interesting insights. It depends on the question you're seeking to provide an answer to, but there are limitations, and they're good for some things and not others. And if we want to understand Ukraine and Russia, maybe we need to look elsewhere for an explanation that's provided by a different theory, namely realism, and with that, its positivist underpinnings, as it were. So constructivism is useful, but in some senses limited. And so the section where it talks about the international system is here, which says agents and structures are mutually constituted. States buy into the idea of anarchy in the international system, and because they do, they act accordingly. However, the entire notion is a social construct, according to constructivists. And they argue that if the international system is not out there, and that it is constructed, then an alternative understanding of security is possible. And that's fine, and I would agree with that, but it doesn't provide us with the solution to the Ukraine-Russia war. It doesn't explain why Russia would attack Ukraine, and that's where I think people like Mearsheimer come into the equation, because his arguments seem to explain in quite a convincing way what Russia is doing in many ways, and adds to the justification that I gave for Russian concern about the expansion of NATO on the one hand, about Ukraine becoming a democracy on the other, that we've created our own image in many ways, and then its economic status as a EU-looking kind of force, as it were, and one that faces to Europe but does not face to Russia. So in terms of insights that constructivism has given, the argument is that analysis of European integration, NATO's persistence, and as well as its enlargement since the end of the Cold War, national security policy, the social construction of threat, we will see constructivism in action with regard to the securitization of disease and drugs and immigration, and the securitization of one of the revered Abrahamic religions into a threat. We've socially constructed, we've securitized a religion, right? So the fundamental basis for that argument is the notion of constructivism. We socially construct things into threats. So a migrant is not a migrant, is not a person, is not a man, is not a woman, but is a security threat that undermines our Western, European or North American security. If it's a Mexican migrant, then it's a threat to US national security, and if it's a Syrian migrant, person, man, woman, child, it's not a human being, it's a threat to our security. And that's what we do. There are even journals, if you look at the issue of migration, that deal with the securitization of migration. I think one is maybe even called the securitization of migration studies or something like that. We do that, humans do that, and we need to be aware that we do that. So moving on, there are different schools of thought within constructivism. So I wrote a paper on what's called thick constructivism, all right? So there's a thin version and there's a thick version. So the thick version, there are various authors associated with that tradition, and it allows us to understand the role of speech and language, narrative. It allows us to understand the role of speech and agents and structures and institutions. And I took that part of constructivism, tried to understand the emergence and the history and the evolution of the chemical and biological weapons control regimes. Examples of institutions that we've seen Gundheimer are social constructs, right? And of course we create the weaponization of biology and chemistry because of course we've seen in Syria the use of chemical weapons. So that thick version of constructivism would fall into this critical sort of thing. And they're interested in power and discourse, language, reality, meaning, And one is a bit more, so the conventional one is a bit more kind of realist, as it were. And that would be the thin version, and that would be discussion and analysis of states and how the environment in which they find themselves, the anarchy, the absence of rule and law and governance in the overall international system of states being characterized by anarchy, the recognition being that that anarchy is created, it's socially constructed, and it comes with that very optimistic thing to say, well, realism would see that in a very fixed way. It would just be a fixed system, inevitable in some ways, conflict is inevitable. Constructivists would see it quite differently and say, because it's constructed, it can be changed. So in some ways, that's also what's maybe good about constructivism. So that brings me almost to the end of, well, that one presentation. Going back to the other one, and I'll make these available, of course, to everybody via Canvas. That ended with I think the discussions about the dissertations, and I gave you two examples. One where somebody had looked at terrorism and had used constructivism, and then another one where the notion that conflict and crime or social conflicts was used in a way that connected them through the concept of constructivism. And this what the student did with this crime and conflict thing was they took a post-conflict assessment strategy. So the UN goes into a country somewhere and it has a mandate to spend money on post-conflict reconstruction, and then when that comes to an end, somebody goes in and evaluates the extent to which it's been successful, whether it's failed, blah, blah, blah. There's a methodology around that process, right? So what this person did was they designed a methodology that could be used in that post-conflict situation, and they made a hybrid model from conflict, which you would be exposed to in this department, but they also borrowed one from crime, and they got the similar kind of things, similar methodologies for evaluating the success and failures of projects, and they made a hybrid model from the conflict and the crime, and then they said this is how it would work in the real world, and their final comment on that was, wouldn't it be interesting to see how this worked in a post-conflict setting, this combined hybrid improved post-conflict analytical model to determine the success and failures and effectiveness of UN intervention. Quite a clever idea, and methodologically informed, using constructivism, using criminology, using conflict analysis, coming up with a hybrid model based upon two different models, and then saying, I've designed this thing, wouldn't it be interesting to see how it worked in the real world? And so they didn't actually go and do it. They didn't go to South Sudan and test it. They said it would be interesting, So it's a very interesting idea that the student came up with, and I think that can count if you can come up with a novel interpretation of something. If you can come up with a novel approach to a dissertation, that can make a difference in terms of your marks. It's quite a powerful thing to be able to say, well, I'm a master's student, I've studied this subject, I've done the epistemology, I've done the theory, I've done the methodology, I've done the empirical, and I've designed this new thing, and I've created a hybrid model of something which can then make a difference in the real world. That's quite a challenge in many ways. It's also quite an achievement, I think, as well. If you can come up with, so it's quite a scholarly thing. You've done the theory, you've done the methodology, the epistemology, you've dug out the empirical evidence, you've explained what your methods of data collection are. You've started by saying, well, this is my argument. You've borrowed these things from two distinct but related, non-necessarily overlapping academic discourses, conflicts and crime. And then you've created a hybrid thing that actually could make a difference in the real world. That, I think, is quite an achievement. And almost a model of good practice, and we can tick a lot of boxes with that. If you do a thing on terrorism and you just ignore the theory and the epistemology, and you don't do the methodology stuff, you might do a very good, interesting dissertation on empirical evidence. You might have found stuff about a particular example of state-sponsored terrorism, or so-called terrorism that's associated with freedom fighters, for example. But if it lacks any theory, then what do you think the comments are going to be? Because we've seen the institutional grading criteria says methodology is an explicit thing in relation to the student attracting marks. So it's good to do. It's good to do that if you can do. So that was that one. That was the crime and the conflict thing, and the one after that was the use of constructivism to understand terrorism. Because terrorism is entirely a social construct. And I mentioned before, the BBC don't even use the phrase. What we're looking at is characterized by complexity. You know, we can't make assumptions necessarily for understanding the things we're trying to understand. So what we're going to go on to look at in this class, you know, beyond this point, is that we want to try and use these discussions about epistemology and theory to allow us to understand real-world conflict, you know, case studies. And so one example would be, for example, we look at Rohingya. And you know the sort of background to that, and the story being that they've been ethnically cleansed from Myanmar, formerly Burma. And of course the British have historically had a role in that. You wouldn't be surprised to hear, and it has had an impact on, you know, the plight of the Rohingya. But there's nearly 1 million or thereabouts being pushed out of Myanmar and into another country, namely Bangladesh. And so one of the things we'll be able to look at is this notion of securitization. And the Rohingya have been on the sharp end of how we socially construct things into threats, in the sense that this has happened to them in Myanmar. They've been constructed as a threat in various different ways. Formerly, they've been considered to be a linguistic and an ethnic and a religious group that do not officially get recognized by Myanmar in its official, you know, government literature. It's very bizarre, even though they've been there debatably for as long as other ethnic minorities in Myanmar. So social construction is a very interesting. But so they've been on the sharp end of the securitization of Rohingya, and with Islam in particular, from Myanmar. But when they get to Bangladesh, of course, Bangladesh being, you know, a fragile state in some sense, is not an advanced industrialized Western nation by any stretch of the imagination, not necessarily welcome there either, you know. So they get it from both angles. They get it from all angles, unfortunately. But we can see how they're socially constructed. We can see the role of social constructivism in relation to the securitization of Rohingya. So we'll talk about that. We can see how securitization works in terms of migrants, in terms of war on terror, for example, in terms of the securitization of Islam, in terms of the way in which disease has become securitized as a threat to human beings, beginning with the discussion about HIV and AIDS in Africa, and ending in discussion about COVID, SARS-CoV-2. We'll be moving on to gender. I want you to see a gender essay that's been submitted by a former student, to see the extent to which the theory and the argument and the epistemology and the signpost to the reader, the structure, the organization, the argumentation, all work in that essay. So it'd be interesting for you to see that. We will be moving on to look at China, and we will be focusing in particular on the role of hard and soft and other forms of power. So there are, as well, hard power's force. It's aligned very closely with realism. Soft power is slightly more sophisticated than that, and we see soft power, examples of it, in terms of cultural imperialism, you know, McDonald's in everyone's high street, you know. But there are other forms of power, and recently the US, in particular, some sort of thinkers in the US have come up with a notion that seeks to explain China's quite sophisticated approach to foreign policy in terms of its engagement with the Middle East and North Africa. So we'll be going on to look at different forms of power and whether they explain or not China's engagement in its Belt and Road Initiative. CPEC in Pakistan in particular, you know, some people regard that as, there are lots of other examples around the world, you know, but it as a very sort of beneficial to, you know, countries in South Asia, but as a sort of a malign sort of aspect to it, in the same way as the Western model does, which is, you know, you swap our engagement with your country for democracy, and you give up your natural resources, and then you end up in debt to us for the next 100 years, or whatever the model does, you know. And part of that is globalization, this creeping cultural and institutional form of imperialism that affects all of the countries of the global south. Some people would sort of ask the question, has the colonial period really ended? So we can look at all of these things. Of course, we'll end up with more questions probably than answers. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your day. Fish and chips in the canteen. I've become a tourist guide for selling university wares. go and lie down in a dark room or whatever it is you need to do. See you next week.